Hello, this is Dan again with part two, finally, of basically my introduction to MGTOW and how I came to adopt a MGTOW philosophy. I left off at the end of the first video, basically talking about how, I really just was completely a blue pill guy in my early 20s, of course, like the vast majority of men. And, I was describing how frustrating it was dealing with my ex girlfriend and just other girls, especially through, the college experience as well, who it's just like, they couldn't be treated the same as guys. Even though I was instilled with the idea um, from, my teenage years at least onward, when I first, like, even recognized that women existed, basically. Um, I was instilled with the idea that men and women are the same, that they're equal, and that you can approach any sort of connection and relationship with a woman the same way you would, just talking to a guy friend to a large extent. I mean, obviously, the stakes are higher in an actual romantic relationship, but, I was led to believe that the differences that existed were differences in individuals and that women essentially could be reasoned with, and that there was no major difference in the way that men and women thought about things and the way that they behaved, the way that they experienced things. And so, at this point, I'd pretty much given up on the ex-girlfriend that I talked about, uh, at least after graduating college during that time period. I had received a scholarship to start law school out at a college in Iowa. And essentially, you know, there was no way that any sort of relationship with the woman that I've been talking about, the girl that I've been talking about, um, there's no way that anything was going to come of that if we lived hundreds of miles apart. And she was already just like she always did. She already had another guy lined up anyway. She really wasn't too damaged or hurt by the whole thing. She pretty much was just willing to move on at that point. And I guess I can't say that it didn't affect her emotionally or whatnot, but the bottom line is she didn't have any problem moving on to another relationship, and this is something that would repeat itself in the future. But I moved to Iowa. I wanted to forget about that whole thing. I wanted to start, studying law and just moving forward with my life in a positive way. Even though I was still completely blue pill, don't get me wrong. It's like I hadn't really learned anything about, how it really is in relationships, how men and women really do deal with each other, and how biased and one sided relationships today are because of the social and legal systems in place. But I didn't really care about any of that. I just wanted to get on with my life and continue my studies. The problem that came along, and this continues to be my biggest problem now, is that within my first 3 weeks or so in law school, I basically broke down at a physical level. Not so much a mental level. I mean, I didn't really seem to be having any problems adjusting to studies and whatnot. And I hadn't even, been a student out at the law school for very long. But for whatever reason, I was actually sitting in contracts class one day, and I had this really bad dizzy spell. And this video is not about my health per se, so I'm going to try to avoid going into too many details about this. But, I had this really bad dizzy spell to the point where I couldn't even hold my head up. Um, while I was sitting there in class. And it's kind of funny looking back on it now. I mean, the issue itself isn't funny, but like, I guess everyone in the class must have thought that I just decided to take a nap or something in the middle of a law school class. But I was just sitting there with my head down, and it's like, as class ended, I seemed to be feeling better. Everybody exited the room basically, and I managed to just leave and walk back to the apartment that I was staying at. And it seemed like, I recovered from that first incident, but basically since that day, and this was all the way back in 2009, in the beginning of fall of 2009, since that day, I've had neurological difficulties. Like, I've had headaches, migraine headaches, like just about every day, or at least, every other day, 4 or 5 times a week, I'll get a significant migraine headache, along with pretty severe headaches 2 or 3 times a week. It's really crazy, and that's another story. Like I kind of mentioned, it's another story in itself that isn't the topic of this little video series. But I tried to continue going back to class. I tried to continue to just like figure out what was wrong by going to walk-in clinics and just taking antivert, or um, I can't think of the other name for it off the top of my head, but it's just an anti-dizziness drug. And every time I would be around, you know, situations that involved a lot of sound sensitivity, or a lot of sound sensory information, I should say, I would get really sensitive to that sound and I would get really dizzy. And the bottom line is, the point of all this is to say that I didn't make it through law school for very long, because I was trying to just battle something that really couldn't be fought. And after a couple of weeks of doing this, really 2 or 3 weeks, my situation, my condition hadn't improved. I couldn't really study. I couldn't really go to class, so I just dropped out. Um, and of course, I didn't. I stayed in Iowa for like another month, I want to say, maybe not quite that long, but it was just like a lost cause at that point. It was a really futile effort, because I couldn't really like find employment or whatnot because of the exact same situation. It's like when you can't function at a certain baseline level, it doesn't matter what else you've got in the tank, or how hard you want to try. You're not going to be able to focus on doing what you're doing. So, I eventually moved back that fall, later on that fall, um, to Ohio. And since then, I've been battling these issues. It, again, I don't want to get too much into this, but it just really, really prevented me from moving forward with my career, with my life. And, the kind of relationship potential, I guess, that I had with this woman, this girl who finally, there was no real age problem at this point. She was going to college herself, or preparing to do so. And so the whole age gap thing was out of the way. But when I moved home, when I moved back to Ohio, she was still with another guy, but, she ended up trying to monkey branch to me, and I was stupid enough to let her do it. So, here I was, um, basically in a situation where I hadn't learned my lesson, and I was really struggling with my life at this point. I was going to doctors trying to figure out, what the hell happened. I seemed to be doing fine. There was no, really obvious reason at that point to explain why it is that I was doing so bad physically, why it is that I had so much sound sensitivity, why it is that my head hurt all the time, but it was, the situation. And the bottom line is, you know, uh, my ex-girlfriend decided that she wanted to get back together with me. She came up with all this bullshit. I had a dream about choosing you over the guy that I'm with now, and all this kind of stuff. And it's just like, again, I hadn't really learned anything about women. I still just thought that, I could work things out, that, it was just a matter of trying harder. And basically, it was my fault for being in the situation that I was in. Um, ultimately we did get back together, but it only lasted for a few months, just like every time that we were together. And then this other guy asked her out and she dumped me. It's like basically she saw once she realized what my situation was, that it's like I wasn't able to figure out toward the end of 2009 going into 2010, you know, I wasn't able to figure out, how I could manage my kind of neurological issues. And this other guy who she had admitted many times before, when we were friends and just acquaintances, I guess, she had mentioned many times before that she liked this other guy, not the same guy she was dating before, mind you, but another guy. Um, he asked her out, and she said, "Oh no, I have a boyfriend." And then she talked to me about it, and I'm just like, "Well, why are you even considering this? Why are you even talking to this guy?" And she's like, "Well, I might still want to be with him." And it's like, "Okay." And then she just broke up with me. And just like a couple weeks later, like 2 or 3 weeks later, she was with this other guy. And they ended up going through this whole relationship, and it's like I was just pissed. At this point, again, I really hadn't learned anything. I was just angry about what happened. But rather than having the attitude of, I'm freaking done with this, I had the approach of, well, I'm just going to like be angry and feel like we should still be together somehow. I'm going to have the perspective of, if it wasn't for the fact that I was ill, or if it weren't for certain other things, if it weren't for this other guy interfering, blaming him basically, we would still be together. And ultimately that was bullshit, but I really just hadn't learned anything at that point. I was still emotional. I was still caught up in my anger, caught up in everything that was happening. The bigger picture was that physically my health wasn't where it needed to be, and it still isn't, quite frankly. But, I just was really overwhelmed with emotion and with anger, or with disappointment, I guess I should say. And so, at that point, we basically just, like I say, we really didn't have a very good standing with one another. We were pretty much just moving along in our own separate directions, I guess. But, ultimately, I was still holding on to the relationship. I was still just angry with the whole thing. And like I say, overwhelmed with not being physically well and having, basically the direction that I was going in life completely derailed. So she goes through this whole process of moving in with this new guy, of getting engaged to him, and all this kind of stuff. And basically, again, I was just pissed. I couldn't see that she just wasn't worth dealing with. That that I needed to get my own health together. That I needed to work on my own life. Um, Basically, there was just no reason for me to keep pounding my head against the brick wall, but I kept doing it anyway. So eventually, this guy decides, oh, she's not the right girl for me. After moving in with her and getting engaged and all that. So credit to him, I guess, for getting out of that relationship. But, ultimately, as soon as he broke up with her, she started messaging me again. Like, she wouldn't even talk to me. She said, we can't be friends, we can't talk because this new guy doesn't like us talking because you're my ex. And that's reasonable, to be honest. But I didn't learn any lesson from that whole situation up to this point. And so as soon as this guy broke up with her, um, as soon as she decided that she couldn't have him anymore, she wanted to get back together with me. And, she ended up saying, oh, you're really the one for me. We're soulmates. And, it's just, again, I fell for every line that she would give, because of this extreme one-itis and because of this, just me holding on to this same situation and not being willing to see the kind of person that she actually was, and kind of what she had been doing to me this whole time. using me as basically a backup guy to monkey branch to when things didn't work out with the guy that she was with. But at this point, I didn't understand any of that. So, lo and behold, I convinced myself that even though I'm still struggling with my health, even though I'm not moving my life in a positive direction, somehow, this relationship was still right for me. And she'd even say things like, "Oh, we'll get through it together. We'll find out, how you can get neurologically well again. We'll figure out together, how we can plan our lives." And I was stupid enough to believe that. Ultimately, something else happened around this time. I grew up with my grandparents on my mother's side, and so I've always been very close to them. And this is in like 2011 at this point, and I was actually visiting my grandparents, and during that visit, my grandmother had a pretty serious stroke. Um, and this was all happening kind of toward the tail end of my ex's previous relationship, the one that she had with the guy that moved in with her and got engaged to her and then broke things off. She was still in that relationship at this time. And so I actually moved back in with my grandparents since I wasn't, able to really work or, focus on doing something to move my life forward on a consistent basis due to, constantly feeling sick myself. And so, basically, I've tried to help that situation where my grandmother was in several hospitals for a few months and then moved back home. And ultimately, my family was, wanting to take care of her. My grandfather, in particular, was wanting to take care of her at home. But the situation was that my grandmother was basically physically she wasn't bad off, like the she could move and whatnot, but she basically didn't know what was going on anymore. It caused some really severe dementia. And so there was a really difficult transition into trying to take care of her at home. And I wanted to help out with that. I wanted to do what I could to make that situation better. Um, but because, I just, even though I was struggling, even though I was sick with my neurological issues, it's like uh, my mindset was still on helping other people. And I'm not saying that I'm this selfless guy or that I'm so great, but what I'm saying is that this is another thing that men in particular are trained to do. I don't regret helping my family, but the fact that I didn't even consider saying, what, this isn't my problem. I love my family, but I'm not going to put myself in this situation while my health is not very good and I don't know about my uncertain future. Instead of really looking at it from that logical perspective, as a man, we're trained to serve. And so, here I was not doing well with my own life, having an ex girlfriend who wanted to get back together through the whole process or during the whole process of, my grandmother's rehabilitation and her coming back home. And at the same time, me wanting to help my grandparents and help my family, continue to take care of my grandmother so that she and my grandfather could have the best quality of life possible during this difficult time. So ultimately it's like I, again, I don't regret helping my grandparents, helping my family. I definitely regret getting back together with my ex, because it was just such a useless, such a fruitless situation. But, again, this is just, I hope you guys can see the trap that I have kind of created for myself. I didn't know why I was having these neurological difficulties. I was trying to help someone else who had had a major health problem. And I was getting back together with someone who said, "Oh, we'll get through it all together." But had never really been there for me. And I think you guys can know kind of where it's going to go in terms of my relationship with this girl, with my ex girlfriend. But this is a situation that a red pill man would not put himself in, but because I was reacting based on how I'd kind of been trained to think, and I was reacting based on, the expectation that men have specifically to do for women, to, put themselves behind everybody else. Again, not saying that I shouldn't help family, but, balancing that to a large extent with, looking at the reality of my own personal situation and my health and my lack of, being able to move my life forward. But from 2011 through basically the middle of 2012, this was the situation that I had put myself in. And, I'll continue this in the next video, but, this is the kind of corner that I had painted myself in at this point. And this was the situation that I had with my ex, where she was like, "Oh, we'll get through it together. I love you. You're my soulmate." And all this bullshit. When my ex proposed to me, you were the first person that I thought of. I mean, that's such a lie, and it's such just a fake line. But I believed it because at this point in my early and mid 20s, I just had no idea kind of how men are trained to think that they need to put themselves last, basically, and that they should trust women, and women are good, and deserve to be treated special, but at the same time they're the same as men, and just all this nonsense. So I had painted myself into this corner. And in the next video I'll talk about how my relationship finally unraveled for the last time with this woman, and just you know, where I went from this point. But, back 2011 and 2012, I just basically, was just making poor choices, and I had the best of intentions, but things weren't going anywhere positive. And that's the situation that I'll pick up in on the next part of this video.